Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Thompson, and I'm the moderator for this session, Soil Health for Watersheds. I'm also the executive director of the National Center for Appropriate Technology, and I'm coming to you from Butte, Montana. And I see I don't have my video on. That would improve things. As you may suspect, and as you'll learn further during this conference, there is considerable evidence that healthy soils can capture, infiltrate, and hold water that otherwise would run off in high precipitation events. Most of the research has been conducted, and stories that are shared by regenerative farmers and ranchers focus on the on-farm benefits of agricultural practices that improve soil health. But what happens if a critical mass of agricultural producers adopts these practices across multiple ownerships within a watershed? Can improved water infiltration and water retention in the soil actually reduce the risk and cost of downstream flooding to communities and infrastructure? And as the frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation events are projected to increase in a warming planet, can healthy soils help flatten the curve of peak flows during a flashy flood event? The previous panel tackled these questions and concluded that there are no simple answers. The wide variation in agricultural production systems, soil types, topography, and hydrology means that there can be no one size fits all. The working groups represented in the previous panel also found that soil health for watersheds doesn't fit neatly within the wheelhouse of any federal agency. Rather, it overlaps with portions of the mandate assigned to multiple federal, state, and local agencies, communities, and farmers. I'm going to share three key takeaways that I picked up from the previous panel. These recommendations include, logically, soil health at scale can have large impacts on reducing flood risk downstream, but there is scant research scaling soil health up to watershed scale impacts. Recommended research paths include improving hydrology models to better incorporate soil health as a parameter, and to conduct watershed studies that compare similar paired watersheds with differing soil health conditions, or to compare hydrologic responses in the same watershed before and after large-scale changes in soil health conditions. The second recommendation that I gleaned is to convene a federal task force to coordinate activities across agencies and develop appropriate cost-benefit tools to capture the multiple ecosystem service benefits that can be derived from investments in soil health. And finally, to coordinate local and regional conversations among researchers, agencies, ag producers, and downstream communities to develop local solutions that fit particular landscapes. This session is going to take on these findings and consider what might be done. So we've got a lot of people who are going to be participating in this, and I'm excited to hear from everyone. We're going to try to be as structured and effective as possible. So we're going to start with a first set of panelists that represent three federal agencies with an interest in the topic. Kevin Farmer is the branch chief for watershed programs at USDA NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Tom Wall works for EPA, where he directs the Watershed Restoration, Assessment, and Protection Division. Terry Zion is Senior Program Manager for Floodplain Management Services for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He is a Silver Jackets Program Coordinator for the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and North Dakota. I've asked them to respond to a few questions about their agency's approach to the topic of soil health for watersheds. I should mention that FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, also was invited to join the panel, but declined because their pre-disaster mitigation programs are currently not designed to support pre-disaster mitigation activities on agricultural lands. However, they did indicate they have an interest in the topic, and hopefully will participate in future conversations. The federal agency respondents will be followed by a second set of panelists who will open a discussion about opportunities for an all-of-government approach to reduce flood hazards through watershed-scale adoption of soil health practices. This panel includes a dynamic duo from Oklahoma, whom I think you will enjoy, And they are Shanon Phillips, who is the Water Quality Division Director at the Oklahoma Conservation Commission, and Jimmy Emmons, who is a farmer and rancher in Dewey County, Oklahoma. And after Shanon and Jimmy have put their ideas on the table, we're going to invite the 4 speakers from the previous panel to hop on, and we will open it up for a free-flowing conversation. If you have questions to put to the panel, please use the Q&A tab for this session on the Whoville platform. My colleague, Martine Guarena, will be selecting questions to put to our panelists. So we're going to get started with Kevin Farmer, Tom Wall, and Terry Zion in that order. I've asked them to take 5 to 7 minutes to respond to 2 prompt questions shared with them in advance. What, if anything, is your agency already doing to promote soil health at the watershed scale? And what research and evidence would your agency need to further support programs on the ground that promote watershed scale soil health conditions? So I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Farmer from NRCS. And I believe he has some slides to go along with his comments. And I am going to take myself off camera. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone. Glad to be able to participate in this opportunity to share with you all some information about our programs at USDA, Natural Resources Conservation Service, and how soil health can benefit our watershed programs, as well as much of the work and the infrastructure and the lives of those of you who are living on your watershed, within your watershed. So I'm going to talk about some of our watershed programs first, and we have 3 primary programs that I want to talk about, and then I'll delve into the questions that Steve had mentioned. The first program is our Watershed Operations Program, which allows for us the opportunity to provide new infrastructure for local communities to protect against flooding and other natural resource concerns, and also to provide watershed protection and recreation, several other benefits. But pivotal for this program is the soil health that happens upstream in the watershed, and we'll talk about that some. And then the Watershed Rehabilitation Program, where we're restoring aging infrastructure, mostly dams, that provide for that flood protection and those other benefits that I had mentioned for agriculture. And then the Emergency Watershed Protection Program, which allows for us to help local communities to recover from natural disasters. Many of those disasters could be impacted by better stewardship and improvements within the watershed. So that first program that I was telling you about, the Watershed Operations Program, it's benefited over 47 million people since the program was put in place in 1948. It does provide for water supply and sediment erosion control and public safety and flood protection, as we mentioned, recreation, as well as wildlife benefits. In order to be eligible for the program, it is required that the projects be at least no more than 250,000 acres per individual project. And then any structure has no more than 25,000 acre feet of total capacity. And then there are benefits to agriculture and rural communities, which total at least 20%. And then it does require a plan, EA, our environmental document. The Watershed Rehab Program, another program that provides for flood protection for these over 11,850 structures that we have across the landscape that are providing as themselves structural protection for flood measures. We also provide public recreation, fish and wildlife management, ag water management, and municipal industrial water supply and water quality management. These projects have to be part of a pre-existing program that was installed with one of the other 4 programs that we offered at the time, the authority of PL 566, 534, pilot, watershed and resource, and RC&D program authorities. And lastly, the last program is the Emergency Watershed Protection Program. So many of you have probably seen instances where there's been wildfires or other natural disasters, and there have been either impairments across the landscape. You see the erosion here, severe erosion that's been caused. Several different types of impairments may occur and disturbances within the watershed after a major disaster. And these impairments, we're able to remedy them through the Emergency Watershed Protection Program and to relieve threats to life and property. With this program, once again, soil health is an extremely important component in providing for resilience for communities as they prepare to reduce the impacts of natural disasters or drought or extreme weather conditions and all those types of things. So all the soil health properties and principles that we're going to talk about lead to a healthier watersheds that can prevent some or reduce the impacts of some of these natural disasters, I should say. All right, so the questions that Steve had posed to us, and I'm probably going to do an extra one here, but what, if anything, is your agency doing related to promote soil health, especially on the watershed scale? So I had mentioned the programs that we're offering, but that's just 3 watershed programs. Our agency offers several other programs within it. Many of you are probably familiar with the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. Then we have various initiatives and programs like RCPP and the Mississippi River Basin Initiative, but there are several other programs that we offer that also provide on-farm land treatment practices that local landowners can implement to support the work that's being done by our broader watershed structures and the watershed programs that we offer. So we require at least 50% of the land upstream of any of those structures or those structural measures to have land treatment practices on them. And many of those land treatment practices are part of what we would call a soil health management system, where we're looking at ways that we can provide for soil health focused activities where the agency's efforts address the root cause of the problems, whether it be water quality issues, things of that nature, runoff, nutrient transport, soil loss, and low water storage. We also, with these soil health management systems, apply principles of soil health to maximize the cover and the biodiversity and continuous living roots and minimizing disturbances. We also seek to increase aggregate stability in soil organic matter and infiltration rates and reducing runoff and nutrient transport and soil loss and other benefits such as water storage. And one of the things that we have done is partner with the Army Corps of Engineers with their Kansas City district and doing some studies on how we could do watershed treatments upstream of their structures, even similar to what we do with our own structures, in order to reduce the impacts of long-term or increased runoff and increased maximum peak flow discharges that you would see in order for them to better manage their structures and their dams in light of the improved soil health management and then reduced runoff and higher infiltration rates. So we're actually doing a study to showcase some on-farm trials to show how these changes in soil physical health and chemical and biological functions within a watershed can provide some of these benefits. In addition to that, a question was, what research and evidence would your agency need to implement policies and programs on the ground to promote farm-based and or watershed scale soil health? So one of the things we discussed was edge of field monitoring. It requires at least 10 years of us to have good monitoring to overcome the upper watershed disturbances. So we need more edge of field monitoring sites and for longer term. And then the need for to have aggregate stability with more than 50% at or above more than 50%. And then also, as I mentioned, our Mississippi River Basin Initiative. So that initiative does allow for us to put watersheds back. It's been there since the early 2000s, but it does allow for us to put on-farm practices and demonstrations that will allow for us to have important data and evidence within that Mississippi River Basin Initiative watershed. And having that information and those on-farm demonstrations, on-farm trials will allow for us to have better, more critical information for our watershed programs. And then also, what soil health management practices are being put in place that actually producers are using and having real empirical data that producers are having and using on farm, and some long-term research that can help show the impacts and the broader environmental impacts for these systems. All right, so the last question we threw in there was additional one here. What success metrics would your agency want to entertain as you act and engage more broadly on soil health issues? So we would want more case studies. We had mentioned that, but case studies that focus on more of a profitability that farmers and producers may want to hear about. And then, not as much focus on yield, but what would be the profitability for implementing some of these measures, such as reduced herbicide and fungicide and insecticide. So the reduction in cost, and because it's more profitable for improving soil health. And then also showcasing reduction in soil loss and increased infiltration rates and decreasing nutrient loss. So all these showcasing the benefits that we're having for these different practices. And then water storage. If you looked at increased filtration and improved structure, especially during a drought time, having that additional water storage capacity, and as we look at these extreme precipitation events and the increased drought, then having that information will be beneficial. So those are the things, Steve. I think my time is running out now. 5 minutes goes quick. So I'll stop at that and stop with that.
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin. And we ask people to hold their questions, and we will come back to those after our presenters have presented. So our next speaker is Tom Wall at EPA. And so I'm turning it over to you, Tom.
All right, thanks. And great to see you. I wish I could see everybody, but great to be on the same platform with everybody. And I hope you can get my slide deck up. John, thank you. And there's a first slide before. Yep, there we go. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to answer the first question about my presentation, how we can help. And then we can talk about the research that can help us help even more. So let's see. I'm with the EPA Office of Water. Obviously, our focus is on water quality. We're always looking for ways to leverage our limited resources and looking for incentives that will help people adopt practices that protect and restore water quality. So we are really excited and have a lot of history I'll go through here of supporting soil health practices, and really excited about the multiple benefits of these practices: improving water quality, storing carbon, increasing flood and drought resilience. As we heard from a previous speaker, some opportunities for increasing producer income. So great opportunities here. One thing, this isn't research, but you've seen a rain table demonstration, I assume, where Shanon Phillips, who's going to speak next, has come up here and put a demonstration on right in front of the USDA headquarters here on the National Mall. You got the tilled soil, you got the conservation tillage, you got conservation tillage cover crops. Put a bunch of rain on, and it is amazing the difference in what you see. That's got to be clearly some benefits for flood and drought resilience from these practices. You can turn to the next slide, please. Yeah, so I do have a slide deck here. I'm not going to go through it in detail. It's really meant to be a reference. It's available in the conference materials. Got links to more information, but I'll just speak across the top of the slide deck here. So two main ways we can help. We have our Clean Water Act non-point source management grant program under Section 319 of the Clean Water Act. That's a live link right there if you want to get into our web pages. This is a great way to provide assistance, right on point. Regrettably, it's kind of modest. It's $178 million a year, which sounds like a lot. To divide it by 55 states and territories, 200 tribes, it doesn't go a long way. The states who get these monies, they put their own name on it, and then work with the conservation districts in the cities. Leverage these funds tremendously. USDA is a great partner on some of the on-farm work that gets done. And then the second bullet here, Clean Water Act State Revolving Loan Fund. This is a real opportunity, folks. It's traditionally used for gray infrastructure in cities, but fully eligible are non-point source activities that are in the state's non-point source management plan under the first bullet, Section 319. Broad eligibility, we really want to work hard with our partners in that program to use it more for green infrastructure, non-point source work. These folks have about 1.6 billion a year in base funding, and they're getting 11.7 billion new funding in the budget infrastructure law, bipartisan infrastructure law. So real opportunities there. Next slide, please. Okay, here's just an example of how the Section 319 non-point source management program is helping. Over 10 years, we racked up what are some of the practices that have soil health benefits. And you can see right here, examples: cover crops, 665 projects, almost 200 conservation tillage projects. So a lot of states are working with conservation districts and doing good soil health work with these resources. Next slide, please. Great. Here's an example of we try to document that we're getting good work done with this program. We do non-point source success stories. Here's an example in Kansas, where they've taken our money, put their brand name on it, Watershed Restoration and Protection Strategies, and work with their partners to do a great project that restored and impaired water. That bullet at the bottom of the page is a little bit of inside baseball. Category 5 means when the state gives us its list of waters that aren't meeting standards and need a restoration strategy, those are the impaired waters. And by doing all this great work here, they've moved that water to where this reason for the water being listed as not meeting standards has been removed. It's now meeting standards for the sedimentation that these cover crop practices and other non-point source practices help to resolve. And there's a live link there at the bottom of the page. You can go to our webpage and find 650 stories covering 1,000 water bodies. Next slide, please. Okay, switching to the great opportunity of the Clean Water SRF, and it's 1.6 billion base funding and 11.7 billion new funding over the next 5 years on top of that base. The graphic on the left shows you the states that are using those funds for cropland agricultural conservation practices. And as you see, there's a lot of white on the map, and we want to try to change that. States that have done the most so far: Minnesota, they're the winner, Arkansas, Ohio, California, and Oregon. Washington State's doing it as well, and then just a much less amount in some of these other states here. So we really want to try to get this map to be much greener than it is now. In terms of actual, that's agricultural BNPs more broadly. If you try to focus in on the soil health practices, we don't have good data there. We do know that there's 4 states that have bought cover cropping equipment with their SRF funds, and they're listed right here. I don't have a slide for it, but I just described for you. In Kansas, they took a $3.5 million loan to a community. They passed the money through to a conservation nonprofit. They bought 8 cover crop interseeders, rented them out to farmers. That's brought cover cropping up by 70,000 acres in that part of Kansas, producing 137,000 pounds of nitrogen, 68,000 pounds of phosphorus, and 46,000 tons of sediment. So that's an example of the type of work we can support by using the Clean Water SRF. Next slide, please. And this is next to the last. I'm getting to the end here. Okay, another example, Iowa. This is some real entrepreneurial work they've done. The Iowa Clean Water SRF program provided $7.5 million to Iowa soybean and their venture capitalist partners. They got into working with farmers directly to pay them to do no-tiller cover crops. No government programs, no government applications. They take care of verification, validation of the credits. And then, so you had communities that needed to reduce their nutrient discharges, buying the credits from this middle venture. They ended up calling themselves the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund. The cities buy the credits that they got by helping the farmers put practices in place. Cargill bought tons of carbon capture credits from them. Very successful model. They won an award from EPA for the innovative financing, this George James Pisus Award. They're expanding from Iowa to Ohio, Illinois, and Chesapeake Bay Basin. A very exciting model again, because the farmer doesn't have to work directly with the government agency with this model. We're very excited about it. We don't endorse them. We don't endorse private entities, but we do give them awards for their innovative work they're doing. So last slide, please. Okay, just a couple of examples of things that we're doing. We do work directly with FEMA. Most of it's been with communities, trying to get them to recognize nature-based infrastructure and hazard ranking insurance rates for communities, doing pilot projects, helping communities access the FEMA programs, have some training modules that'll be coming out soon. They're not ready yet, but if you go to the non-point source website link earlier in the slide deck, when they're available, you can find them there. We have a new cooperative agreement with the National Association of Wetlands Managers. We're doing some training programs, workshops coming up. So the bottom line is we can help. Here's some examples of how we've been helping. We're really excited about the co-benefits. In terms of what research is needed, I would say we need to ask FEMA what they need. What does FEMA need to be more willing to work in the space? Because I think it's pretty clear that there's some opportunities for drought resilience and flooding resilience here by these types of practices on the farmlands. One last thing I'll close. I don't know if you're familiar with the Conservation Technology Information Center, CTIC, the website, ctic.org. They are working partners with Nature Conservancy and others on Optus, the system for documenting the cover cropping and conservation tillage all throughout the Midwest. They're going across the country. They have a webinar, June 21st, 2021. Professor from Ohio State University, for minutes 25 to 33, she documents how they would find watersheds with Optus, where there's lots of cover cropping and conservation tillage, and ones that don't have that. And then they looked at identity rates from the USDA flood risk management agencies, crop insurance programs. And they're able to show that in the watersheds that have much more cover cropping and conservation tillage, the payout rates are lower for crop damage due to extreme events. So that's, I think, the type of research that we want to see more of to get more support for like flooding agencies being interested in these opportunities for cover cropping and soil health. That's the end of my presentation. Sorry if I took too long.
That's great, Tom. Thank you so much. It's a lot of information there. And we're going to go right next to our next speaker, who is Terry Zion, with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He's Senior Program Manager for Floodplain Management. He's also involved in the Silver Jackets program in 3 states in the upper Midwest. So over to you, Terry. Terry, I can see you, but I'm not hearing you. John, is there anything you can do on your end? We're not hearing Terry.
Yeah, Terry, it doesn't seem like your mic's working.
How's that?
Perfect.
Yes.
Is that better? Okay, great. All right. So thanks for the introduction. I am Terry Zion. I work for the St. Paul District of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And one thing I have to say up front is USACE is not a granting organization. So we don't provide, say, funds to individuals or businesses to do projects. However, you know, we do work with many other agencies through the programs that were mentioned. So I coordinate Silver Jackets for 3 states, and just as simply as I can put it, it's an interagency collaboration effort where we look to leverage the resources of state and federal agencies together to meet local problems. And those issues are defined by the states, not by the Corps. So it's very much a local program. And we don't really have a policy directly mentioning soil health, but we do really emphasize the use of green infrastructure and holistic watershed approaches to flood risk management. So this really fits in well. And in fact, I have a couple of studies going right now in Wisconsin. One is under the Silver Jackets program, and one is under the Floodplain Management Services program. And we are looking at this watershed approach to reducing flood risk. And one of the things that I brought into it that I insisted on was that they look at soil health, good soil health practices, such as cover crop. And so what we've discovered, and these studies aren't complete yet, but what we've discovered is that at the downstream end of the watershed, you can come up with a reduction of maybe 5 to 20% of the peak flow, and maybe 5 to 10% is more realistic, but we have had a little higher reductions in some cases. And it doesn't sound like much, but from a watershed perspective, it's huge to get that kind of a reduction at the downstream end of a watershed. And I know that we also spoke with some farmers who did some presentations for us at a farmers co-op meeting, and at the field level, they might be getting 80% runoff reduction. But on the watershed scale, we're getting, conservatively, I'd say maybe 10%. And so there's a few things to keep in mind with that. It's essentially using the soil as flood storage, and that gives most benefits just downstream of where you have the storage, and it dampens out as you go downstream, which is why you have that, field level at 80% and the watershed level at 10%. But once again, think of it in terms of a levee system you might have downstream. And and our projects typically have a 50 to 100 year project life. And over the life of that project, if you could reduce a large flood flow by 10%, you're greatly increasing the resilience of that project, especially considering the uncertainties of climate change on the hydrology. And so I think it's an incredibly important component or tool in our toolbox that we really need to keep looking at. And the other factor too is, these other programs they work with, like planning assistance to states, it can be, it's basically anything in water resources, and a lot of the project requests we get are water quality, especially in-stream water quality. And so there's a lot of erosion and sedimentation issues we deal with. And so, this good flood risk management is really, usually a combination of strategies, and flood risk management really goes hand in hand with environmental stewardship. And we're starting to approach it that way with the watershed, the holistic watershed process. And so sediment reduction is another very important factor to us. And so the use of cover crops or, conservation tillage, these are really good long-term efforts to work with other methods. It's not something on a watershed scale you're going to accomplish in a short time, but if you implement it and you keep up with it and you promote it, over time, you're going to see greater benefits from it. And so factors that we've considered, percent of the watershed that's in agriculture, the percent of the participating agricultural acres, and then the location of those areas where you're putting that treatment into the watershed. It can have an impact. And so things like, technical and financial support for farmers is crucial. And on the core side, we can do the technical part, but we can't really, we can support in terms of doing these studies, but in terms of direct promotion at the field level, it's not something we do. And to hopefully I can keep us moving here, I guess an area of research that we have really seen as important from our studies is translating the field scale projects to watershed scale effects. That's something we really need to get a better handle on. And I would hope that with a little more real data and more real world applications, we'll have some better numbers to put in our models. But right now, if we get 10%, I think that is huge when you're thinking of in terms of lowering the peaks on more rare flood events. And so these programs that I work with, they're going to be in place. They actually have done quite well under the President's infrastructure bill, and there's a lot of potential to continue these studies and to look for more. And it's very much a cooperative effort across the agencies and with our local landowners and partners, and everybody needs to be involved. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Terry. All right, so now we will move to the next section of this session, where we start to examine how we can all work together through an all-of-government approach that includes not just federal agencies, but also more local, state, regional agencies, as well as people, the landowners, the private landowners, the farmers and ranchers that are on the ground and are at the core of all of this. Our first speaker is going to be Shanon Phillips, and she's with the Oklahoma Conservation Commission, and she'll be followed by Jimmy Emmons, who also works part-time for the Oklahoma Conservation Commission when he's not farming and ranching on his 2,000 acres and meeting with folks like us. So Shanon, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to let people know the two questions that we've asked you and Jimmy to consider here, which is that given that this issue crosses disciplines and agency jurisdictions, how should we move forward in taking action at the watershed scale or conducting relevant research? And then also, how might we take an all-of-government approach that includes local, state, and federal agencies, local communities, farmers, and ranchers? So thanks for joining us, Shanon, and it's over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Steve, and really appreciate the opportunity to talk to folks today. As Steve said, I'm Shanon Phillips from the Oklahoma Conservation Commission, and I'm just going to present some ideas today that I have for how programs can work together to advance soil health. If I can get my slides, there we go. All right. So in the spring of 2019, the lower Arkansas River Basin in Oklahoma and Arkansas experienced record flooding. Levees were breached, 5 people died, and the result was an estimated $3 billion in damages. You can see from the NASA imagery the extent of flooding when you compare the 2019 images on the lower to the 2018 images from a similar time period. The red boxes show an approximate location of the zoomed in areas, and which really show flooding south of Tulsa, which is a small town, or south of Bixby, which is a small town near Tulsa, Oklahoma. During these events, all eyes were really focused on the flooded urban and suburban areas and the infrastructure that was impacted. A little bit of focus on agricultural damages and destroyed crops, but that really wasn't, of course, where the flooding originated from. And the focuses that came later on rebuilding the damaged levees wasn't necessarily going to prevent this from happening again. So later that summer, the Oklahoma legislature conducted a special study session to discuss the impacts and solutions. And my executive director, Trey Lamb, really wanted people to think about how much of the flooding downstream is affected by the landscape upstream. Of course, he also wanted to promote soil health for its sustainable ag benefits, but he felt like this was an excellent opportunity to really introduce the concept and benefits to a new audience. So we know that water holding capacity in the landscape has been affected by many things, but we wanted people to think about how much soil organic matter affects water infiltration. So if you consider that the Arkansas River Basin drains major portions of multiple states before it reaches most of the heavily flooded area, and if you think about the fact that much of that area that it drains is cropland or managed pasture land or rangeland, in other words, that landscape has been significantly modified from what it was. A lot of it is either bare or covered in monocultures. And as a result of our modifications, we've significantly affected the amount of soil organic matter. In Oklahoma, in effect, we've halved the amount of organic matter in soils, dropping them from pre-settlement estimates of 5 to 6% average down to 1 to 3%. And lots of soils with people that we work with are below 1% organic matter. And as we all know, the higher the soil organic matter, the greater the water infiltration and holding capacity. So shouldn't flood response be focused on the upper portions of the watershed rather than the lower portions? So we really ask ourselves, theoretically, what good could it possibly do if we worked in the whole watershed instead of just where the major flooding occurred? And we found that if we were to increase soil organic matter by 1% in crop and pasture land and 0.5% in rangeland, which we know from working with producers in Oklahoma is a very reasonable amount, and we did that throughout the watershed, we could see massive increases in infiltration and curb flooding impacts. Effectively, we could increase soil water holding capacity by 811 billion gallons in the watershed before it reaches the Oklahoma-Arkansas state line. And just to put that in perspective, that would be like building duplicates of the 4 largest Corps of Engineers reservoirs in Oklahoma, but they would be empty before each rainfall event instead of already holding significant water amount. So even the legislature in Oklahoma recognized that if we were going to do something about flooding, it was going to take more than one program from one federal agency, which is why they brought the special study together. But they weren't thinking big enough because they didn't invite the other states that really affect and were affecting the problem. So if we were to bring partners together to promote soil health as a means to tackle multiple challenges, we have lots of examples of big projects with silos and acronyms and other limiting factors that ultimately didn't work. And we may or may not fully understand what led to those failures, but we also have quite a few examples of successful programs to follow. And in my opinion, these programs have at least 3 things in common. The first of which, they are locally led. So there is a local buy-in to the process. The people who are going to be making the change are open to addressing the problem, and they're involved from the beginning in working to find the solutions. Secondly, the partnership has to be as collaborative as possible. So virtually anybody who has a related role should be included in the process and should be contributing something other than just ideas and criticisms. So case in point, after that Arkansas River flood, we had a meeting at EPA in Dallas, which was a great meeting. And the folks from FEMA came to talk to the EPA non-point source folks about how we could work collaboratively with the FEMA funded programs in our states. But they never spoke to their FEMA funded state people. So when we went back as non-point source people to talk to the FEMA people at the state level, they didn't really have an incentive to work with us. So we didn't get very far with that. I think, that's just why it's important that, more than one program has to be focused on on the solution. And then the last thing I think that, I mean, maybe not the last thing, but one of the last important things that I've noticed is that there has to be an appropriate level of funding for the things that you need funding for. So if you only have funding available for installation of conservation practices, but not monitoring of environmental impacts, not for personnel, not for equipment, or the other things that are really needed, then it doesn't matter if you have $10,000 or $10 million. Your program isn't going to make an impact. But also, if you want a program to be successful, that funding needs to come from as many different sources with significant interest in the success as possible. And that way, you just ensure that everybody has skin in the game and stays working towards until you reach a solution, a successful solution. So not all programs are successful all the time. But here are some examples of some successful partnerships between federal agencies that I am aware of. And one example is the National Water Quality Initiative, which is a partnership between EPA non-point source program that Tom spoke about, and also NRCS. And the EPA non-point source folks are wonderful folks, and they were forever telling us at the state level that we really needed to collaborate more with NRCS. But we just didn't get very far until the NRCS folks were also telling their team, you really need to work more with the non-point source folks. And here's a program that's going to make that happen. And, you know, this program still works better in some places than others, but this is an example of what we think is a really successful partnership in Oklahoma. The Little Beaver Creek watershed is a small watershed in southwest Oklahoma that is a major tributary to Lake Waurika, which is water supply for the city of Duncan. Land use is primarily rangeland, a little bit of cropland in the watershed. The soils are erosive, soil health is poor, and as a result, Little Beaver Creek is impaired and on that 303D list that Tom talked about earlier for sediment and bacteria. And Lake Waurika was sedimenting in so quickly that they had to dredge so that they could still pull water out of the pool and supply the city with drinking water. So but it also has too many nutrients. So we started a collaborative effort between NRCS and the local conservation district and the Conservation Commission to address that problem. And it really began with sitting down at the local level and studying the problem. We provided them water quality data. We did watershed tours. We compared the landscape and how the stream changed as it moved through the landscape, and really all agreed on what the likely contributing factors were to the problem. Then we developed a computerized watershed model that could be used to kind of further visualize the sources of impairment and predict the impacts if we could address those. And then we discussed and made sure that the model was a good depiction of what the local experts understood was going on in the watershed. So they trusted the results of the model. Then they developed a ranking and priority system that really focused on the conservation practices that they felt would be most acceptable and most successful at addressing the water quality problems that we saw. And then they began a huge outreach effort. They sent letters to every landowner in the watershed. They followed up with personal visits, and they were very successful in enrolling lots of folks in conservation practices. So there was so much demand for the program that they were then able to expand it beyond the original highest priority areas to some slightly lower priority areas because people were so willing to participate in being part of the solution. And part of that was enabled because they had a devoted funding source to address the problems in the watershed. So 4 years after the start of the project, we were able to see, during the whole period we're doing water quality monitoring, 4 years after we started the project, we started to see real water quality benefits that were measured by decreasing bacteria in the stream. 6 years in and the stream's been delisted for E. coli bacteria. It's still listed for turbidity, but we're seeing improvements there as well. So we're still working, and RCS is still working to put more conservation on the ground and to collect more water quality data, just so we can verify that these programs are, and these results are lasting, but the impact is real and measurable working in this collaborative watershed scale. Another great example, and I always love to highlight our neighbor to the north. Kansas is a national leader in their soil health program. Their state agencies, Department of Health and Environment and their Department of Agriculture Division of Conservation, have really successful soil health programs. They have many pioneering producers who practice regenerative ag across the state. And if you haven't been to the annual No-Till on the Plains meeting, you really need to prioritize that, because there's a great deal of information that's shared there. And we've already talked about the Silver Jackets program, so I won't spell out what that is, but they have a great Silver Jackets program where I think they've really recognized every federal, state, and non-governmental entity that has a role or an interest related to flood management and flood mitigation, and those people are at least invited to participate in the Silver Jackets team. I don't know that they all participate to the same level, but they're all invited, and I think they're always envisioning additional people who should be at the table in order to be part of the solution. And as a result, they've even successfully gotten engineers to think about changing numbers, which is kind of hard for some of us. So they talked to the Corps of Engineers folks about some numbers that were used in one of their flood impact studies and flood projection models, and recognized that the default values that were used for soil infiltration were from the 1950s. And based on the data that they'd seen collected from soil health and regenerative ag, they knew that those numbers weren't necessarily representative of what was possible. So as a result of this collaboration, the Corps, like it sounds like in parts of the upper Midwest, are considering modifying the numbers that they use in their calculations. But another great example is that Kansas is actually working with FEMA to add soil health as an allowable tool in their state hazard mitigation plan. And what that, for those of you who don't know what that does, and I only partially know, as I understand it, if the state hazard mitigation plan defines the processes and priorities for the state to both study flood hazard mitigation and then implement programs to address flood hazard mitigation. So they can actually begin, collecting data and doing studies to look at how adopting soil health practices would then could benefit communities downstream, as well as potentially eventually fund the implementation of those practices. So I think that's a great success. And then, just kind of to wrap up, nationwide partners have worked in part through EPA programs, but generally partnering with multiple federal, state, and local programs to fully or partially remove at least 695 water bodies from the state's impaired list that Tom talked about earlier. They worked at meaningful watershed scales in partnership with appropriate groups, and none of it happened without resource allocation. Those successes weren't free. But when they all came together and put some skin in the game, then all of the resources didn't have to come from a single program. And this same success that is here in water quality programs could happen when we apply the same principles to soil health. And the added benefit would be that we'd probably then have more of these water quality success stories. So with that, I will stop sharing and turn it over to Jimmy to share the producer's perspective.
Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you so much, Shannon. And Jimmy, we'll just go right over to you for the perspective on the ground.
All right. Well, so I'm having a little difficulty on the share screen. There it is. There it is.
You are showing your screen and you're in presentation mode, so you're good to go, Jimmy.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. Shannon done a great job laying it out here. What I'm going to talk about now is how I've worked with federal partners, state partner, and local partners for the last 11 years on our farm, and kind of show what we can do and then how we can do that to scale. So, like I said, I'm from Leedy, Oklahoma, and Northwest Oklahoma. And where there's life in the soil, there's always hope. And these cover crops, like we were talking about, Terry mentioned that a while ago. If we can get something like this growing on the ground, we can definitely mitigate flooding. We slow the water impact down on the soil. We can also slow the water going down through the soil as well. So there's lots of things that we can do as long as there's hope there. So this is one of the projects that I've done. Like I said, 11 years ago, when I decided to go down the road with soil health projects, I reached out to my local conservation district that I was on, the Association of Conservation Districts, OCC, the Conservation Commission, NRCS, and Noble Research to ask them to help me put data together as we've done these projects so that we could really show the benefits or not benefits, whatever that was going to be in the future. And so for the last 11 years, we've been working in this particular field here that you see. And this is where we, last year, NRCS came out, and that's a 4-foot wagon wheel down there. We parked a center pivot in this field, stationary, and put on 7 inches of water. You see the rain gauges run completely over there. We've just shut the pivot off, and there's no standing water in this field. And so it's all went in and percolated down. So our water infiltration rates went from 1/2 inch an hour up to well over, 3 to 7 inches an hour, kind of depending on where you're at in the field. So this is what we can do if we apply all the principles of soil health and work together. And this field has really changed. The carbon level's a lot higher. Our infiltration rates, like I said, has really skyrocketed, and so our soil health is very good. This is some of the first data that NRCS helped me pull the first year that we planted cover crops 10 years ago. And if you look there on the left side where there was no cover crops at the end of the season, we had 4.6 inches of water in the soil profile versus 7.52 where we had cover crops. And what we quickly learned was in Western Oklahoma, in an arid environment, and that was back in 2011 and 12. We were in a severe drought. Our water evaporation rates were extremely high. And so we were actually losing more water to evaporation during the summer months than we would have been if we had that covered. And so the next year we done the same thing, but we grazed the cover crops and we used a little bit more water. But then when we repulled these cores in the spring, we showed that we gained that water right back. So immediately I knew early on that we were on the right track, and we had things that we could really benefit our soil. So this is what we want our surface to look like. We want it to be very aggregated, very porous. If you look at that, you see several water infiltration points on this soil and this surface. That's the key to it. As we start building aggregation and building soil structure, we have water infiltration, we have gas flow in and out, airflow for the soil biology to work. So I've got a tool on my iPhone that it's called a ProScope, and then we can zoom in on that. This is what the surface really looks like, where we've had multiple years of soil health practices and all the principles. And so this kind of gives you a visual about how we can infiltrate that water versus the way we used to. And if you want to look at where we were to start with, this is what a lot of our surface looked like in the beginning. Very poor structure. You don't see hardly any water infiltration points on the surface there as well. And so what happens when we zoom in on that, this is what that surface looks like. This is in a traditional system of heavy tillage, high inputs, where we have no soil structure. So when we get these big whiplash weather events happening, what happens here to the water? Well, it quickly runs off. And that's what Terry was talking about and downstream flows and streams. And so we quickly shed off our water. And what that does is we have high sedimentation, high turbidity, high nutrients in the streams, stream loading, as Shanon talked about, into the lakes that have to be dredged out. And so this is some of the things that we can really, really improve if we work on that. So if you look at, and Shanon done this study on the Arkansas. So if we look at Emmons Ranch and Farms here, you know, what could we do and what have we done over the last 11 years? Organizations that work with us. We have 2,000 acres of farm ground. We have 6,000 acres of rangeland, much like what Shanon did. And I just use 1% straight across the board. You could discount some of that for rangeland if you wanted to, but I think this is all very achievable in what we've been able to do. If you hold 27,125 gallons of water for every 1% of soil organic matter you have in that, you take my 8,000 acres total acreage, if I could really improve that just by 1%, that would lead to 217 million more gallons of water that Jimmy has to work with on the farm. Now that's really mind-blowing if you really look at that. And if we look at that water holding capacity, what does that really mean? Well, that means if you were an irrigator and it's an acre foot of water, 326,000 gallons of water, I would have enough irrigation water to irrigate 665 acres with 12 inches of water on it. So that gives me a lot more opportunity in an arid environment to grow cover crops, secondary crops, to keep the land covered, to keep the land grazed in a good fashion. And it also slows the water down going out. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more here on some other producers that I've helped over the years here that are literally 100 miles from me in each direction. So I can show you what we can do in a watershed scale if we do this together. This is Russ Jackson in Southwest Oklahoma at Mountain View. Russ is on the left. A neighbor is on the right. You can see that Russ had a big rainfall event. We at the commission had just been to Russ's farm the few days before and had a soil health event, and Noble Research had been there and had done water infiltration rates. So we knew that Russ there on the left could take in 6 inches an hour easily with his water infiltration. He'd had lots of no-till crop rotation, cover crops, planned grazing management, done a real good job, 6 inches an hour. With this rainfall event of 5.3 inches came along, Russ took in 143,000, almost 144,000 gallons of water. His neighbor on the right, conventional tillage, small grains, monocropping, no cover crops, heavy tillage, synthetic fertilizers as well, no grazing, only had a 6/10 of an inch an hour, half inch an hour of water infiltration. So he only took in 16,500 gallons. Now, if you'll look down this road here on the right, that water is draining away from where we're standing taking this picture to a creek behind them houses there. So all this water is leaving, going into the watershed, down the stream, down to a lake eventually here. And so that's where we get the sediment, the nutrient loss, and the loading of the streams. So if you look at this, what we can really do, this shows it. But then what happens after this rainfall event in 2 weeks? Notice the difference here. This is a totally different rainfall event of another 3.5 inches 2 weeks later. You see the cover crop on the left is greened up, but look at all the water on the right. There's more of it now. And once again, we're loading the streams. Now behind this houses on both sides here, there's a creek that has a gravel layer in it. While we were out in Russ's field pulling gettings and looking at his profile, we went down 16.5 feet and hit a gravel layer. And that is the gravel layer that's in the stream behind Russ's dad's house and the neighbor's house here. And to address kind of what Terry was talking about, where they were seeing a 10% decrease in downflow streams. Well, what's happening here, Russ is taking it in, and that water is going to move down through that soil profile. Eventually, it's going to get down to that gravel layer, and it's going to go out and come out in that stream, much like a spring would do. And so we can't hold all that water back, but we're going to slow it down by a great percentage. And it will also be clean because we have a lot more carbon in the soil here on the left. So we can't hold all the water back from the ponds and lakes, and we really don't want to. That's a natural flow process. But what we can do is we can mitigate the amount of turbidity and nutrients that's going out. Plus, it gives us extreme drought protection when, like right now, we're in a big drought. Russ has more water to work with in that profile than the one on the right. So we move up the road and now in north central Oklahoma and near Mino. This is Mark Thomas on the right, his neighbor on the left. They had a 6-inch rainfall in a very short time period. Mark Thomas has been doing soil health practices, cover crops. He's got his winter cereal rye planted there on the right already. The neighbors, the day before we were there, was getting this all prepared out to plant on the left, and still haven't got that planted because of the weather and not being able to infiltrate the water. And so we can do this completely anywhere in the nation if we manage it right. Here's the example of Mark's, the water on the left out in his field, how clear it is. If there is any runoff with that cover crop and that soil health management and aggregation out there, the producer on the left, then this is what our water looks like downstream in the lakes. And Shanon talked about that as well, being in Lake Waurika, where they have to dredge all that sediment that's going down there. So, you know, by working with the federal partners and the state and local partners, we can really do this. And by all this measuring and monitoring that we've been doing, we see this and we know that it can be done. And if we could do that on a complete watershed, where we had everyone in the watershed participating, and it wouldn't be quite like it is with the two neighbors here, one doing a great job and one not doing a very good job. If we could really do that on a big scale and work together, we could really, really have a solid impact downstream on mitigating flooding, but also mitigating drought as we go forward. So there's lots we can do. I'm not going to talk too much longer. It's been a great experience for us to participate with all the partners to show what can be done, and the data that they've helped me collect there has really told a great story of how we can do that. So, and I will quit sharing and turn it back over to you, Steve.
Oh, that's great, Jimmy. A perfect example of a picture tells 1,000 words. So appreciate the words and the photos. So we are going to open it up to all of our panelists, including the panelists from the last session. And so I ask all of you to turn on your cameras, and I encourage our audience to view in the gallery mode so you can see all of us together. And I think the way we will start is to invite any of our panelists and participants here to ask another panelist or the group as a whole a question, and we'll get it started that way. If anybody has any questions to start with, Margaret, I see your hand and you can go first. Your camera's off. There you are.
But it's back on. I really appreciated every one of those stories and every one of the suggestions. And I wanted to go back to something that Shanon said, which was that I think it was you, Shanon, who spoke about the kind of, about needing to have incentives to states to make it work, because in some cases, the state isn't motivated, the state agency isn't motivated. You were proposing that maybe sometimes need to have incentives to have the state agency get engaged on soil health. I'm just interested in your thoughts and others. What kind of incentives it's for state agency level engagement do you think might work?
I think really the challenge that we had in working with FEMA is that, states have limited resources and their programs are existing, right? They've already been working down a certain path and haven't been able to do everything that they need to do. So I think in order for all of the agencies to come together on a soil health initiative, then all the different, federal and other types of funding agencies and partners need to come together with a separate focus on soil health. And just like it worked for the NWQI, where the NRCS and EPA really came up with a separate initiative to work together, I think it's not going to be enough for one federal agency to say you should be working with all your state partners and other federal programs on soil health. They all need to come together from the top down funding, of course, is critical. But I think there are also, some ways that we can, if we all have a similar outcome that says, you need to be working on, planning and shared resources and coming up with a step-by-step plan on how we're going to put part of our resources towards this. Within the next 10 years, FEMA could say we'd like to have all state hazard mitigation programs at least consider how soil health practices could be incorporated into the state hazard mitigation plan. I think those types of things are going to be what's necessary in order to really get everybody talking about it. Just so that, because we already have a full plate.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Why don't we go over to Julian? I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. And I thought that all great presentations, and I'm going to ask a question and a comment from the perspective of someone who leads a national program with local and regional ties, the USDA Climate Hubs program. And I really appreciated Shanon's comment about locally led initiatives that are collaborative and funded, of course, right, to be really successful. And so my question is there a role for these regional entities, these regional collaboratives, to bridge the divide between local municipalities, states, and the federal government, and providing that in between, being a consultant, collaborating, offering those resources from up top, translating them into ways that resonate with communities, right? But also recognizing there has to be some sort of horizontal integration that is whole of government, whole of society. So USDA working in partnership with FEMA, working in partnership with EPA regional offices. And so I guess, how could we integrate soil health into existing climate service networks, for example, rather than recreating a new soil health initiative? Or, so my question is there a role for the current structure, or can we duplicate what we know works to an extent for soil health? Just because I know that, demand for our services already exceeds our capacity, but, we already know that we're getting a lot of demand, right? So can we somehow work that framework in of kind of regional entities that cross not only disciplines, but scales and federal agencies, right, to benefit soil health in your work?
I'll take a stab at that. Yeah, I think there's definitely a role for regional organizations to help bring people together and fund maybe pilot scale efforts that really focus in different regions of the country. And I think there's a lot of potential. I think that has been demonstrated in other programs. there's so much great work being done, but but we're all struggling. We've talked about the needing the economic numbers. We've talked about needing the university research. And one way to get that is if we start to really recognize and summarize all these other environmental benefits. And the best way that we're going to do that is if we have these entities that have the capacity to collaborate across state lines, are going to help that. And whether that's, starts at the federal agencies, but I think that's important. But I think the regional entities are a great opportunity for that as well.
Would anybody else like to respond to that question?
Yeah, this is Terry. I'd like to put a little bit in on that. So I think it was a really good question, and I think the states can do quite a bit. We talk about regional, state, local. That the solutions are local. They know what the issues are, but I really think to get a lot more adoption of this, you're going to need the technical and financial support to the farmers. And the thing that I always am amazed when I talk institutionally is kind of this us versus them, and the them is always the farmers. It's like, well, I've never met a farmer yet who wants to harm the soil or the water. That's how they make their living, but they're also running a business. And so this has to be a net benefit to what they're doing. And if that's probably going to take some kickstarting, maybe to get it going on a farmer by farmer level. And then the technical support, farming is incredibly technical, and just if they need some assistance, with the technology and the advice, and if they need some financial support, I think the states could be in a great position to help.
Thanks, Terry. Over to you, Tom.
Sure. I was going to ask Julian and Kevin that I see in USDA press releases $1 billion for climate smart commodities. Whether that is a great opportunity to provide some funding assistance. I assume it's going to be increasing soil carbon and soil health practices. That sounds like a great opportunity.
I think it would be for those producers and individuals who can participate, will participate. So I think it would be a great opportunity for our producers. And that combined with the other programs that we're offering, I think there's a lot of opportunities there, Tom, for us to really focus on more soil health and holistic approaches to soil health and watershed improvement. So yes, I think that's a great new opportunity that has been recently announced and on the table.
Julian, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, and I think I'll add, so the climate hubs cannot apply for that grant themselves. That's in the FAQ, but I think there's a real opportunity for the climate hubs to help the funded projects really disseminate the findings so that they're actionable, decision relevant to farmers, ranchers, the general public. That's where they do their best work. And so I think there's a great role for the hubs there. And as I noted in our mitigation and adaptation strategies for USDA, I think there's a great role for the hubs and NRCS among all our other agencies to build resilience and soil health. And so, just to note that there are existing efforts as well besides the partnerships program, although that comes with a lot of money, that we are working within current authorities to really push soil health among other climate resilience opportunities across USDA.
Great, thanks. I'm going to pose the next question here. There's been some references about the benefit cost analysis, and that can be a tough nut to crack within each agency. I'm thinking in particular on FEMA on that. I'm wondering how we should think about benefit cost analysis when there are multiple benefits and multiple beneficiaries, so that mission-driven agencies all have a little skin in the game. I think that was Shanon's phrase, is just a little bit of skin in the game from all the players. So how can we design a benefit cost analysis tool that addresses multiple benefits that bridge across the silos of individual agencies? I am not directing that to anyone in particular, but wanted to see if anybody wanted to weigh in on that. Andy, do you want to respond to that, or have you got the next question?
Yeah, no, just a comment there. I think, we are kind of all doing our own work, and it can take that time to look across. But one thing that I'd say I'm not that well educated about is what winning looks like for each of those agencies. And I think that's something that, I'm more well versed in talking to Jimmy about, hey, this is what the inches per hour is going to change like if you do these things, or that kind of comes naturally to me. But I would love to have just a kind of volley of people saying, well, I need, is it parts per million nitrate, nitrogen in effective reservoirs? Because I think having that common playbook, if I had that, then I think as a scientist, I could kind of go away and say, all right, what numbers are realistic? So both the values, like what winning looks like to you, but then also, are there thresholds? Like, hey, this many parts per million doesn't do anything. I need it to be here. I think that could drive a lot of good collaboration.
Well, why don't we try that one here? If we go around the horn a little bit, maybe I'll start with you, Tom. What does winning look like?
Oh my, well, cleaner water, and in this space, we're talking, and some of the biggest water quality problems we have are too much nitrogen and phosphorus in the water, too much sediment, and too much pathogens. And so, cost-effective ways of reducing those loads is really important to us. It's sobering, say for phosphorus in fresh water, how low the values are in a still water in a lake. I mean, you're talking, 30, 50 parts per billion can start to bloom a way too heavy crop of algae. When you start talking about what's coming off farm fields, the folks who are doing great work, there's a big disconnect between what comes off the land and what the water can absorb before you start having water quality problems. So those most cost-effective practices can get you the most water quality improvement. And in many cases, the good news for us here is in this conversation is working with farmers on conservation practice systems on the land is some of the most cost-effective ways to try to get the water quality better. And ideally, you find that win-win spot, as I mentioned, where you've got the water quality benefit that makes me excited, and you've got the soil carbon capture that makes other folks excited, and makes Cargill excited, and the flooding resilience benefits that Terry talked about, and hopefully FEMA will be interested in.
Great, thanks, Tom. So winning includes clean water and nutrient reduction. Let's make this a bit of a lightning round. So just quick responses. Kevin, do you want to weigh in on what does winning look like from a watershed perspective?
I think winning looks like at least 50% of the land upstream treated. And it looks like local producers and local landowners and land managers throughout adopting practices that will benefit and those downstream. So I think winning looks like a all hands on deck kind of approach with a minimum of 50% of inclusion.
I love it. I love a number there, 50%, at least 50%. Okay, Terry, lightning round. What does winning look like for the Army Corps of Engineers?
Winning would be to be able to quantify, say, in a 50-year life of a project, which is designed with risk and uncertainty considered, how much risk are we reducing to that project? How much risk are we reducing to that community? If we could quantify that, that would be a big factor and greater attention for these concepts.
Excellent. Shanon, you're at the Oklahoma Conservation Commission. What does winning look like?
Winning means healthier natural resources, cleaner water, healthier soils, but it also means more agricultural producers being able to stay in business.
Over to you, Jimmy.
Yeah, I gotta agree with that. Winning to me is keeping the water and my soil in place on my land. Gives me more water to grow with in dry times and prevents flooding downstream. So all my partners down from my farm clear to the Gulf of Mexico can be happier and have cleaner and safer water.
Excellent. Okay, let's go over to Martine. Martine, have we got any good questions from people watching this?
Sure. First one was for Kevin, stating, do you think an impoundment design could be reduced by improved soil health? Maybe even avoiding environmentally sensitive areas to reduce Section 404 mitigation costs?
So, part of the impoundment does have what we call the sediment storage. And like Jimmy was just talking about, keeping the sediment on his land. So if we could reduce sediment loss, and we could reduce the erosion and the need for storing that material, I would say, yes, you could have some reduction in the amount of an impoundment or of storage needed for a structure. But looking at most structures are designed for those PMP storm events, and carrying those maximum flood events, that's not something that we're going to immediately be able to, carry in a soil, but we can reduce that, So one, yes, you can do it if you reduce soil sediment loss and the need for storing sediment. But two, we can soften the amount of runoff from that PMP, but we can't just reduce that and provide protection if we can't guarantee upstream management, excuse me.
Okay. In other federal programs, required elements for applications such as cost benefit analysis have been identified as an obstacle to applications for grants and assistance. Is this a problem for smaller farmers and ranches that might be beneficiaries and might pass benefits downstream? And that's open for any federal agency.
Any takers on that one? Again, the question about benefit cost analysis.
Yeah.
Just on the part of the question, that was a multi-part question, but the part of the question about the small producers, I do hear that that applying for the government programs can be burdensome for somebody who's already too busy running their business, and that's what we were excited about in the one slide I showed about that model where a middle entity is established that can kind of take care of all the paperwork, so the farmer can work with them and don't have to worry about the trust of the government programs having data about their operations. Something like that might be a helpful part of the path forward.
Yes, we're actually contracted by the California Department of Food and Ag to work with the Healthy Soil Program, which is really burdensome for a lot of, especially small farmers, immigrant farmers, to be able to understand, to work with software, multiple programs and so forth. So it is, well, as I stated before, a digital divide, if you will, regarding that. Okay, so have any of the panelists worked with producers that have actually had their soil types reclassified because of soil health practices? This helps the flood modelers get a better infiltration rate for hydraulic models.
Want to take that one, Jimmy?
Yeah, so actually NRCS has looked at our soil and has reclassified it from a used to fluent that it was originally classified as a very light colored soil into a molic soil. So they have changed that, and I've known some other producers across the country that has had their soils reclassified as well. So we know it can be done. And you got to really do an intense job of the soil health practices to do that. And it took 10 years to get that done. But our state soil scientist, NRCS, Steve Allspaw, and noticed that as well, and was happy to do that for us. So we were very excited to see that change.
Before we go to another question, before we go to another question, we're getting close on time, our team. So just wanted to see if any of our panelists wanted to, if there's any points that you wanted to make that you haven't already made or that haven't been brought up. And if not, then we'll go to one more question from the audience. Okay, Martine, you got one more.
Okay, and this one's for Terry. In your work using soil profiles as a landscape scale sponge to help mitigate flood impacts, have you measured any increase in groundwater levels or groundwater supplies?
Well, one of the issues we're dealing with, it hasn't been so much because of this, going to the soil health factors in the modeling, but in general, we're getting a lot more groundwater just because of the precipitation regime. That's, you know, we've had increased intensity in our rainstorms, and it's caused some issues. Actually, it's gone the other way in a lot of places where it's actually causing some surface flooding, and so it's got nothing to do with the farming, but it's kind of hard to tease those two apart. But I would think that everything I've seen, you know, the modeling we're doing doesn't get into the groundwater portion really. It's more of a, you know, that runoff coefficient, and that, you know, what's the infiltration rate. But I can only imagine that it would really improve agricultural, you know, groundwater conditions to do this. I can't quantify it from my modeling though.
Martine, I think we've got time for just one more question if you have one.
Yes. This one's for Shannon and Jimmy. Is there a way to leverage environmental and agricultural groups, the Sand County Foundation and the Aldo Leopold Land Stewardship Awards, to help raise awareness of these regenerative practices that Jimmy, Scotty, and others have adapted to improve outcomes for people, planet, and profits?
You want to take that, Jimmy, as a Leopold Award winner?
So sure, as a alumni of the Leopold, we talk about this a lot, and how we can encourage people and agencies to really be aware of what we can do and what we have done by partnering with the agencies to collect the data that will help the modeling and help carrying them down the road as we get these true data points in. Then that database can grow, and then that will help in the modeling for the future. And just like Kevin was the question about, you know, size of impoundments. Once again, we've got to get that data in, so that helps with them designs, and we got to do it on a watershed scale basis. Just Jimmy doing it by himself in one watershed is not going to impact that reservoir, but everybody doing it will. And so, yes, we can leverage them and use them spokespersons out there to really help awareness and help that database as well, so that will help the modeling down the road.
Okay, we're gonna bring it to a close. This is a great conversation. I have a feeling that this could continue for a while, and I certainly expect, after having gotten to know all of you over the last couple months, that this will not be the final conversation across disciplines, across silos, across agencies, community, local, state, national. This conversation is gaining momentum, and so let us all go back and continue to expand the circle and bring in new players the next time around. And NCAT will be having internal conversations about how we can support that. And I want to thank all of our panelists. This was really a joy to learn and listen from you all, and thank you for participating.